In today's video, we're going to be using one of my favourite methods for making a quilt using scraps of fabric. It's super fun to make and you can make your quilt any size you like and no patterns needed. Now I'll be sticking to a colour scheme of black and white, but you can use another colour or just mix it up with all sorts of different colours. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut up some batting, and I'm going to cut 42 squares that measure 10.5 by 10.5 inches. But you don't need to go with the size, you can make your quilt blocks any size you like, although keep in mind the lengths of your scraps, so don't go too big. So I have cut 42 pieces of batting, and I'm also going to cut 42 squares of fabric for my backing, with each piece measuring 10.5 by 10.5. Now the backing fabric can be all in one colour, or you can use up scraps and go with multiple colours. I'm going to stick with one colour only because I've had this bolt of fabric for a few years now, so it's time to start using it up. You're also going to need some fabric scraps, and you will need mostly strips of fabric, and I'm going to be using strips that measure anywhere from 1.5 inches to 2.5 inches in width. Now that's just my personal preference, but you can also go larger or smaller if you like. Now since I don't think I'll have enough of the scraps to complete a full quilt, I think I may need to cut some extra strips from my yardage, so I have some on hand here ready to go if needed. So I'm going to start with a piece of backing fabric, and you can see that I've placed the fabric face down on the mat. Now then I'm going to take a piece of the batting and place it on top of my backing fabric. Now I actually sprayed a little bit of 505 spray to hold the two pieces together, but you don't have to do this. I've done a ton of these without the spray and it works just as well. Now if your idea of a good time involves fabric scraps, a rotary cutter and maybe just one more fat quarter you didn't need, Craftsy is about to become your favourite corner of the internet, and I want to thank them for being the sponsor of today's video. Now Craftsy have over 2,000 step-by-step classes on all sorts of topics, with a huge variety of quilting and sewing classes taught by expert instructors, some of whom you may already know. And you don't want to miss the pattern library, where as part of your membership you can download free quilting, sewing, crochet and knitting patterns. I've been watching the long arm quilting show on Craftsy because I finally got myself a quilting frame, and let's be honest, I need all the help I can get. This is my very first attempt at long arm quilting, and while I still need to master stippling, I've got my eye on feather designs next. Now the feather stitching lesson alone has been incredibly helpful. The show is packed with practical tips, techniques and different approaches to quilting. Now my only complaint is that I just wish there were more than 2 seasons. And if you don't have a long arm, there's no shortage of classes on free motion quilting using your home sewing machine, all the way from beginner to advanced. So if you're interested in mastering your free motion quilting, whether it be on a long arm or a home sewing machine, then why not become a member of Craftsy today? Now the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a full year of Craftsy Premium for just $1.49. This offer is for new members only, so grab it while you can. And now, let's get back to the tutorial. Okay, and now the fun part. I'm going to take one of my fabric scraps and lay it face up diagonally across the batting. And then I'll take a second piece and I'll just lay it next to it to see if it will go well with the other piece. I also need to check that it will fit across the square. Now this one looks good, so I'll place it face down over the other piece, and I'm going to go ahead and sew along the edge with a 1/4 inch seam. I just used a regular foot for this, but you can also go with a walking foot if you prefer. You don't need pins for this, just line it up nicely and adjust the fabric as you go. Once the two pieces are sewn together, I'm going to press them open. Now I know a lot of people finger press, so you can do that if you like. It will definitely speed up the process, but I prefer to use the iron. I feel like I get a better result doing it that way. And just a tip here, if you do decide to press, then don't go too heavy-handed, as it can stretch the batting. Also, if you're using a synthetic batting, bear in mind that it can melt, so you might want to use a pressing cloth. And now that I've completed my first 2 strips, I'm just going to repeat that with another strip. So I'll place it on top of the previous strip and sew again with a 1/4 inch seam. And once it's sewn on, I'll press that one open as well. Now I'm going to continue doing this until I have covered all of the first half of the block. And I must admit, I sometimes spend way too long trying to find just the right strip to match, but I really enjoy the process. Now once I've completed the first half of the block, I flip the block around and I repeat the process on the other end. I'll just keep sewing on strips and pressing between each one until the entire block is complete. Now at this stage the blocks look quite messy, but now comes my favourite part. I'm going to flip the block over so that the back is facing up, then take my ruler and carefully line it up along the edge. Now using my rotary cutter, I'll trim away all of the excess fabric from each side. If you don't have a rotary cutter, that's fine, just use your scissors. This step is so satisfying because it cleans everything up and gives that block that nice crisp edge. It's amazing how much more polished it looks after just a few precise cuts. Now the next step is optional, but I went ahead and trimmed my blocks so that they all measured the same size. I used a square ruler for this, but you can use your mat. The reason I did this is that when quilting like this, it can draw the batting in and warp the block. I ended up trimming them back to 10 inches by 10 inches, but you could trim them to 10 1/4 if you prefer. Now that I have all my blocks complete, I'm going to go and lay them out on my design floor. I like to do this before I start sewing so that I can spend some time to arrange them properly and so I don't get fabrics clashing or doubling up in areas. Now since I have 42 blocks, I'm going to go with 6 blocks across and 7 blocks down. Now at this point we're ready to sew these together, and if you've ever done Quilt-As-You-Go like this, you'll know that you can end up cutting and sewing lots of bits of sashing together to each and every block, which can take a ton of time. So my goal is to keep this really simple and quick. I'm going to start at the top of my quilt by sewing these blocks together, and then I'll sew the next 2 and the last 2 on the end here, and then sew them all together to form a row. But before we continue, this is where you want to decide if you want your sashing sewn on the front or the back of the quilt. I'm going to sew my sashing on the back, so I'm going to sew my blocks together by placing the front sides of the blocks together. If you want the sashing on the front, you would sew your blocks together by placing the backs of the blocks together so that the seam shows on the front of the quilt. I'm going to be using a 1/2 inch seam, and the reason I'm going with a 1/2 inch is that we're sewing a bit of bulk here, and a 1/2 inch seam will take in all of the fabric. Now try to be as accurate as possible with your 1/2 inch seam. You really don't want to go over 1/2 inch. A little under is fine, but going over won't work so well when it comes to adding the sashing. So you can see what it looks like once it's sewn, and if I flip it over we have these big thick seams here. Now at this point I like to take the iron and press each of these seams open so that they lay nice and flat. And now that I have my rows completed, the next step is to sew them together to form the quilt top, and I'm going to be using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'll start with just 2 rows, and it's worth taking the time to pin everything in place to ensure that the seams line up nicely. It might take a little extra time, but the finished result is definitely worth the effort. So you can see what it looks like now that I've sewn the first 2 rows together, and if I flip it over you can see that we have these bulky seams on the back. So before I go any further, I'm going to go ahead and trim off a bit of the excess fabric and batting around these seam joins, and I'll repeat that on the other side. This will reduce some of the bulk so that it's easier to sew in the next step. Okay, so I've sewn the rows together, and as you can see the front is nice and neat, but on the back we still have all of these seams to contend with. So what I'm going to do is cut some strips of fabric that measure 2.5 inches wide by the width of the fabric, and I'm going to go with this white fabric so that it contrasts nicely with the dark fabric that I've chosen for the back. I'm going to have to join 2 strips together to get the length I want, but once I have them joined, I'm going to go to my iron and fold both sides into the middle and press all the way along the strip. Now if you have one of these bias tape makers, then by all means use it. It will help speed up the process immensely, but I actually didn't have the size I needed, which is 1 1/4, but I do have one of these simplicity machines. I've had this machine for years but really used it. I even gave it to a friend who didn't use it much either and gave it back. But now I'm using it again and I can't believe I ever gave it away. It's great. It made the process so much faster and the strips came out perfectly. Now that I have my strip, I'm going to place it over one of the long seams running from the top to the bottom of the quilt. and I'm going to top stitch this strip on both sides, running quite close to the edge. Now this took a little bit of trial and error to get this just right, as I kept running off the edge, but once I got the right foot on my machine and I nudged the needle over a bit, it all started to flow, and I got through it a lot faster than I thought I would. I used a walking foot with a stitch in the ditch foot, and that worked well as I was able to line up along the edge. And when I got to a seam, I simply lifted the foot and tucked the seam under and continued on. So be patient if it's not working for you right at the start. Just take your time and it will come together. Once I'd finished sewing the vertical strips onto the quilt top, it was time to sew on the horizontal strips. Now this part usually goes a lot more smoothly because you don't have to deal with as many bulky seams, and this makes the sewing process a lot easier and a lot more enjoyable. It's a nice, satisfying step that really starts to frame the quilt beautifully. Okay, the main part of the quilt top is done, and you can see how the stitching looks on the front of the quilt. At this point, you could stop there and add a binding if you want to complete your quilt. But if you want to add a border as we have done here, just head over to the website and we'll show you what we did.